This is Al Jazeera.
Well, I'm Rochelle Carey. This is the News Hour live from Doha. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. Catalonia's deposed leader, Carles Puigdemont, calls for continued democratic opposition to Madrid government's imposition of direct rule. Myanmar's government takes over farmland abandoned by Rohingya fleeing persecution. A U.S. grand jury reportedly approves the first charges into the alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election. And first delayed, now suspended indefinitely, Kenya's election commission calls off voting in 4 opposition strongholds with fears of more violence.
I'm Joanna Gajarowska with the latest sports news, including a racism row overshadows Game 3 of baseball's World Series.
In the past hour, the deposed Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont has called for a democratic opposition to stand against Madrid's takeover of the region.
Per defensar les conquestes assolides fins avui.
The best way to defend what we have conquered so far is to have a democratic opposition to Article 155. This is the conclusion of the deliberate attempt against Catalans, who have for many centuries felt different. We have to overcome any threats and to act in a civic and peaceful manner.
Andrew Simmons is live in Barcelona. So, Andrew, still not a lot of clarity on what happens next, really, on either side. What did you gather from what Puigdemont was saying?
He didn't say a great deal, did he, Rochelle? But he was talking about a democratic resistance to, well, he didn't use the word repression, he did in his previous address, but he is really calling on supporters to peacefully support him in resisting the power of Spain coming down on this region and taking over. Now, what that amounts to remains to be seen for obvious reasons. They're not going to give a preview of what they plan to do, but one thing does appear to be the case, and that is that this is rolling out in a sort of slow motion effect. Once again, it's been one step at a time. It's not one of those crises that just suddenly snowballs, although it was a very dramatic time on Friday when this Article 155 was rolled out and the declaration of secession came just ahead of those powers being invoked. And that's the point that Carles Puigdemont is making. He didn't make it in his speech, but everything rolls on from this. That is that it was a democratically elected government and it made a democratic vote. The opposition, most of the opposition boycotted it, but it was 70 votes against 10. And that was a democratic process as far as the government he runs is concerned. And he claims that Article 155 rolled out after that, and therefore the secession was in place before Article 155 was put in place. So this is all perhaps a bit technical, but it matters a lot, because as far as he's concerned, he's still president, and as far as his cabinet's concerned, they're all ministers as well. I will put one thing right. We did hear a report that he was speaking from the government buildings here in Barcelona. He wasn't. He's in Girona, which is his home, and it appears that all ministers have gone home for the weekend, while people try and work out what on earth is going on in this region. So it is really a little hard on folk. Do you not think? No, but it isn't a funny situation, and it is a very, very serious one. But it has to be said that the people, they're the important aspect to all of this, and they are confused, and they are not quite sure. And that isn't, you could argue, that's not just the secessionists' fault, it's also the fault of Madrid, perhaps, in communications. People want to know just what is going to play out, and what we're hearing is a number of things. We've heard that Soraya Sáenz, who is de Santa Maria, she is the Deputy Prime Minister, and she has said that she's going to appoint a series of people who will effectively run this region. And she is, in effect, in the position of of the president now, although she obviously doesn't go by that title. She's Deputy Prime Minister of Spain. Will she be here in person? That's unclear. It's unlikely. She will appoint a series of delegates, or for want of a better word. And then as far as the Interior Ministry goes, appointments are being made, sackings are taking place, particularly in the areas of the police, and there will be a rollout over the coming week of government from direct rule, with elections to follow, snap elections to follow in December. Rochelle.
So, Andrew, you make the point, as Puigdemont did as well, that this vote won in the parliament and the Catalan parliament. But it needs to be said that there is by no means any unanimity in the region in Catalonia, that everybody there wants this secession.
Sorry, I missed the last part of that question.
No,
there was a bit of interference.
Absolutely,
Sorry.
absolutely. I'm saying I think it needs to be reiterated that there's no unanimity in the region that everybody that is a Catalan actually wants this secession.
Well, no. I mean, you have a point there. You have a point in the sense that you can do the mathematics forever and a day, but there was a referendum which was hugely affected by the fact that it was declared illegal by the Spanish state, and there was an obvious stay away from people who may have felt they wanted to vote yes in a slightly more peaceful situation that was more perhaps legal, for want of a better word. But that is history. The situation now is that whatever the squabbles are about the legalities or anything, there is now a gulf between the secessionists and those who don't want to break away from Spain, bigger now than, well, one would argue, bigger now than ever. And that is something that's going to take a long time to fix, regardless of where this region goes. The police force, for example, the Mossos, which is a 17,000 strong body of police, men and women, and they are all now under orders to be professionally neutral in their views, and they could be ordered by Madrid to intervene in any civil unrest. One of our sources, who actually predicted what was going to happen on Friday, way ahead of the event, he insists that Mossos will be used actively in situations of public order. Because it is more of an engaged force with the people. It's more likely to get cooperation than the national police, which were in effect demonized by their actions in the referendum. People here feel very strongly that any situation where the Spanish National Police are engaged is going to cause immediate flare-ups. Even flying over with helicopters during the demonstrations causes a big response from people on the ground. So expect to see a rollout of peaceful demonstrations. There are many planned on Sunday, right across the country, not just here in Barcelona, and not just the pro-secessionists, but also the unionists as well. And also expect to see a rollout of more and more political moves taking power from this region to Madrid.
Okay. Andrew Simmons, live for us in Barcelona. Andrew, thank you. So let's take a look back at the events over the past month that got us all to this point. So on October 1st, Catalan leaders defied a Spanish Supreme Court ruling and held a referendum on secession, as Andrew referenced. Now, despite violence from Spanish police ordered to stop the polling, a turnout of just over 42% saw a landslide vote for independence. A week later, about 50,000 people rallied in Madrid to oppose Catalonia's drive to secede. The Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, also demanded the regional leader, Carles Puigdemont, clarify whether he had actually declared independence. Well, Puigdemont ignored the deadlines, and on Friday, his parliament voted to proclaim its independence. Immediately after, Spain's Senate voted in favor of Article 155 of the Constitution to let the Spanish government dissolve Catalonia's administration and impose direct rule from Madrid. So James Kurlinski is a professor of politics and policy at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, and he joins us from London via Skype, and we appreciate your input so much. There's a lot to discuss here. I guess let's start out broad and then we'll narrow down to Madrid. Broadly speaking, What role does the EU or do other countries in the EU play in what is happening now? Or can they play in what's happening now?
Well, it's very important to emphasise that, a declaration of independence really means nothing on the international stage unless it's recognised. And so it's the reactions of the international community are crucial in these sort of situations. And what we've already seen is the United States has come out and said very clearly, we respect Spain's territorial integrity. The British government has done the same. The French government, a whole slew of governments around the world have already come out and said, look, as far as we're concerned, this changes absolutely nothing. Catalonia is still an integral part of the Spanish state and will remain as such. It really is very significant in how quickly that has happened. And this is really, I think, for all of us who follow secessionist movements, we're expecting this, that there was never any realistic prospect that this declaration of independence was going to get wider support. The question, though, now is very, very much about internal Spanish politics and how that plays out. And if that should, for any reason, turn violent, then how does the international community respond?
Absolutely. So let's talk about that now. What is on the line now for how Madrid handles this? Because when you see the video of how this referendum played out and that video going around the world, I'm certain that there are people in Madrid that wish maybe they could take that back or handle that differently. So going forward, what is necessary for the parliament in Madrid to do to, I don't know, manage this, tamp this down? I'm not quite sure.
Well, I mean, what I would say is if there was a playbook for how to handle secessionist movements, especially in a democratic state, then Spain has pretty much broken every rule that you can imagine. It's handled it atrociously throughout all of this. I mean, what really is surprising is that all the polling had shown for a very long time that the majority of Catalans were opposed to independence. However, at the same time, a majority wanted a say on their future. So it was very much a chance, give us a vote, and we're going to vote against this. But the more and more Spain resisted that vote, actually the more it drove independent support, sympathy. And I think, the referendum was, it was a crucial moment in many ways because the police going in, as you noted, in such heavy-handed fashion, it will have made some people think twice. But I think there will also have been a lot of Catalans who looked at that and said, look, is this the Spanish state that I wanted to be part of? And so there is this polarization, which is very apparent in society and which makes this, as I say, a very, very confusing situation as to what really happens now and what Spain needs to be doing. Sadly, there seems to be no indication at all that the Spanish government wants to try and sit down with the Catalan authorities and say, look, how do we try and resolve this mess? And I think, to be honest, it's hard to see, where this goes from here.
Quite a time. So a lot to be witnessing. James Kurlenzy, thank you very much for your insight. We appreciate it. Myanmar state media says the government will harvest rice from farmland abandoned by Rohingya families who fled violence in northern Rakhine state. The paddy fields cover 71,000 acres in Mung Dao, the area worst affected in the crackdown by the Myanmar military against the Rohingya. Lawrence Louie has more from Yangon.
There are a couple of ways to look at this. One is that this is simply a practical solution. The rice crops are ripe for harvesting, and if they were left to just stand in the fields, they would go to waste. So the Myanmar government has put in place a plan to harvest the crops, bringing in combined harvesters and laborers to do the work. An agricultural ministry spokesman has told us that the local government is in charge of the harvest and the eventual sale, and the proceeds of the sale will go to the local government, although there are no details on how they plan to use it. But the other issue is this raises ethical questions. As the Asia director of Human Rights Watch puts it, you really can't call a crop ownerless when you've used a campaign of arson and violence to drive the owners from their land. And this is what the Myanmar military has been accused of doing. And the other issue pertains to future use. Is this harvest perhaps the first step of the Myanmar government to appropriate the land from Rohingya refugees who've been driven to Bangladesh? Now, if it is, it will raise other questions. What about repatriation and resettlement of the refugees? Now, granted, we are a long way from that, Bangladesh and Myanmar officials haven't yet worked out details of how they plan to repatriate Rohingya refugees, but there will have to be other questions that need to be asked, such as where will they return to and what will they return to if their farms and villages are no longer there.
Local officials in Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar are proposing a voluntary sterilization plan for overcrowded Rohingya refugee camps. They want central government to approve a plan for both Rohingya men and women. Aid groups at the camp say they are working with limited resources and a lack of family planning could make things worse. Plenty more ahead in the news hour, including following the Harvey Weinstein scandal, women say they feel they have a voice against sexual harassment. Plus, why Chile's government is struggling to contain a growing number of new HIV infections. And in sport, an NFL owner apologizes after referring to players as inmates. Joe will have the details. U.S. media is reporting that a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. has approved the first charges in the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election. The charges are said to still be under seal under orders from a federal judge. Special counsel Robert Mueller, a former FBI director, is leading this investigation. It's not yet known what the accusations are, but anyone charged could be taken into custody as early as Monday. Rob Reynolds joins us live from Washington, D.C. with these pretty dramatic developments. So, Rob, there's a lot we don't know, but what is it that we do know?
Well, as you mentioned, Rochelle, we don't know exactly who is under indictment and on what charges because that information is sealed. But classically, in an investigation of this type, and Robert Mueller has managed many investigations of great complexity, you start, the prosecutor or investigator would start with the lower ranking people, put pressure on them, possibly in the form of indictments and charges, and then see if they will make a deal and provide information on people who are higher up the chain in the conspiracy, if there is a conspiracy. Now, Mueller has been investigating a broad range of charges and leads stemming from the finding that Russia meddled in the U.S. election in 2016 and investigating the question of whether the Trump campaign was involved directly with, in collusion with the Russians, and whether Trump then tried to cover up or impede or obstruct justice in the investigation of that possible alleged collusion, notably by the firing last May of James Comey, the director of the FBI. Trump, the president, later admitted in a television interview that he had fired Comey in connection with the ongoing Russian probe. That led to Mueller's appointment as special counsel, and Trump later boasted in the Oval Office to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, about how the Comey firing had lifted great pressure off of him. The Mueller investigation is also looking into the financial dealings of the Trump family and its associates. One target of the investigation could be Paul Manafort, who was who served as Trump's campaign manager for a period of time in 2016. In July, FBI agents raided his home in search of possible documents or other information. Manafort was paid more than $17 million by a pro-Moscow Ukrainian political party, but did not register as a foreign agent with the United States authorities as is required by law. Other possible targets of the probe include Michael Flynn, who served briefly as President Trump's national security advisor before being fired after lying about his contacts with Russian officials. Rochelle?
All right, Rob Reynolds live for us in Washington, D.C. Rob, thank you. The U.S. Defense Secretary has warned North Korea against escalating its nuclear and missile tests. James Mattis is in the South Korean capital, Seoul, for 2 days of talks. He says the relationship between the two allies has taken on a new urgency amid heightened tension on the Korean peninsula.
Make no mistake, any attack on the United States or our allies will be defeated. Any use of nuclear weapons by the North will be met with a massive military response, effective and overwhelming.
Tony Bertley is following developments from the South Korean capital.
There were strong words from the United States Defense Secretary. He was here in Seoul on part of a 2-day visit, partly to discuss the defense of the peninsula, which is an annual thing between the US and South Korea, and partly to pave the way for President Trump's visit on the 7th and 8th of November. Now, that visit in itself is creating increased tensions here, and General Mattis was at pains to warn North Korea that any nuclear attack with weapons would be met with a very, very massive military response, and he did intimate that North Korea could not win in that situation. Having said that, his tone in the last 2 days has been more conciliatory than that of President Trump. You may remember his fire and fury speech at the United Nations in August, and also his threat to totally destroy North Korea. He has resorted to a war of words of mass destruction, and people are worried that the words may turn to weapons. There was a lot of concern here. The United States has upped its defences. It's brought 3 naval carrier groups into the region. It's moved its F-35 stealth fighters to Japan just in case that President Trump's visit produces some kind of reaction from North Korea. They've conducted 6 nuclear tests. Most of those have been underground, but the North Korean foreign minister has warned that they will conduct an atmospheric nuclear test, and who knows what that will provoke. But there is a lot of concern on the Korean peninsula about what will happen. General Mattis has said basically the actions of North Korea are provoking and accelerating the situation and causing a greater possibility of conflict on the Korean peninsula. But he also stressed that the need was for diplomacy, for talking. He said the United States did not want war. It wanted a denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Now, he also said, though, he couldn't imagine any situation whereby the United States would accept a nuclear North Korea. Now, North Korea is well on its way to being a nuclear power, so something has to give. The big question here is what will give and who will give it.
Voting in 4 opposition strongholds in Kenya's presidential election rerun planned for Saturday has been indefinitely suspended. Police have fought with protesters in those areas during polling day on Thursday. Unofficial results show the president, Uhuru Kenyatta, was won with 97% of the vote, but only a third of registered voters cast their ballots after opposition leader Raila Odinga called for a boycott. At least 6 people have died in violence during the election. Famina Miller is in Nairobi following the developments.
Less than 24 hours ago, this area, Kawangware, in the western part of Nairobi, was relatively peaceful. There weren't any demonstrations or protests following Thursday's election, but now that's all changed. This was an area that housed at least 30 shops, a restaurant, a bar, and even homes for people living in this area. But it was attacked by a mob of protesters. The people here are calling them gangs. They say this area was petrol bombed, bringing down any infrastructure, and they've been left with nothing. William is a painter who operated a small business in this area. And William, we were talking to you and you said that you felt victimized.
Yeah, I felt victimized because we expected this one. We had rumors that some people would come and burn down our businesses. They said somebody is going to die today. That was yesterday. So we expected. We stayed outside to guard our businesses. Unfortunately, the police came, dispersed us, and they took advantage of that one. They came, they burned down here, they drew cans with the petrol. That's why the fire spread so quickly. Yeah, when they met you along the way, they could check your finger whether you voted. When they saw that you voted, they beat you, they would beat your finger thoroughly, they will release you. We are very sad, we have a house.
Thank you, William. Now, William is just one of many people here who doesn't know what he'll do next. He doesn't know where he'll go. What they have tried to do is they've put up this makeshift fence to at least try and protect what's left. There isn't very much. When we moved out of this area, further down the street, we were met by a very aggressive mob of people who said we couldn't move any further. They said they would chase us out of the area if we tried to stay too long. This situation in Kawangwere is unsafe, it's tense, and people here say they're worried.
People in the Libyan capital, Tripoli, have been reduced to drilling through pavements in search of water because of a breakdown in the main supply. A lack of investment and security has caused the taps to run dry. Victoria Gatenby reports.
This is how people in Tripoli are getting their drinking water, drilling through pavements to access underground wells in a desperate search for supplies.
The situation we're in now is affecting the entire city. No water means no electricity. Tenants can't pray without water. They can't go to the bathroom. They can't do anything, not even drink. The problem is that the government does nothing. So now we are digging for water as a temporary solution.
Earlier this month, water supplies were cut to households for urgent maintenance work. To make matters worse, an armed group then sabotaged Tripoli's drinking water infrastructure. Engineers are working hard to repair it, but a lack of investment and a shortage of spare parts means progress is slow. 6 years since the death of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya remains divided and devastated. The country is plagued by internal fighting and financial collapse. The water shortage is another challenge for the UN-backed Government of National Accord based in Tripoli. It's already dealing with a failing health service, spiralling inflation and public sector strikes over pay. People are demanding solutions to their worsening living conditions. The head of the Water Resources Authority says he needs more money from the government if things are to improve.
In the absence of adequate spare parts, a lack of money, security chaos, people have been taking matters into their own hands, and this in turn has affected the performance of the system.
The UN says divisions are deepening in Libya and that finding a political agreement is the only way forward. For people struggling to access basic supplies like water, it can't come soon enough. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
The Hollywood actress who sparked a global campaign against sexual harassment is told to rally she was silent for 20 years but won't stay silent any longer. Rose McGowan is one of more than 30 women who have accused producer Harvey Weinstein of rape or sexual harassment. Kristen Salumi takes a look at whether this will affect change in the workplace.
By now it's a familiar story. A young woman trying to make it as an actress, put in a compromising position by a Hollywood power broker. Karen Sclair is one of hundreds of women to come forward with her experience of sexual harassment in recent weeks. It started with this man, filmmaker Harvey Weinstein, who lost his job after it was revealed he paid millions to silence his victims. Since then, the spotlight has fallen on other powerful men, including Sclair's alleged harasser, the filmmaker James Toback, Amazon Studios executive Roy Price, Fox News anchor Bill O'Reilly, and fashion photographer Terry Richardson have lost jobs as a result of accusations. And even 93-year-old former President George H.W. Bush has been forced to apologize for groping women in his wheelchair.
I feel like I have a voice and I don't have a fear anymore of saying it because I realize so many people went through it. Once it kind of felt like we could come out of the hole, then I felt like, okay, then I can be a voice too.
Any social worker will tell you the problem is much bigger than Hollywood. 1 in 5 women say they've suffered some form of sexual harassment or abuse.
People are afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of being reprimanded, retaliated against, isolated. So even if they're legally protected, they could just face a lot of kind of social isolation at work.
But women, traditionally underrepresented in leadership positions, are increasingly finding strength in numbers. Whether it's here at the Detroit Women's Convention, where they're working to get more women elected.
As you can see, it is a global movement.
Or on social media, where the Me Too hashtag has been used by millions of people sharing their own stories of harassment. It's a movement, according to the executive director of UN Women, that is having an impact around the world.
Gender-based violence is a universal problem. what is also common and what binds women, no matter where they are, is the fact that you are alone often when it happens. And what makes the Me Too hashtag exciting is suddenly for someone else to stand with you.
I'm assigned to teach drama at a public elementary school.
Karen is still performing and teaching drama, as well as an important lesson for women, how to use their voice. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
Time for weather with Steph. You got some news out of Central America?
That's right. It's really wet at the moment, and now we've got storms popping up all over the place. Let's take a look at the satellite picture then, because that shows you just how much cloud we've seen recently. And these pictures are from Nicaragua, where we've seen so much rain. We've got a fair amount of flooding. The floodwater also washed away this bridge, and this is normally the start of the dry season. No sign of that just yet, and plenty more rain still to come as well. So here's the satellite picture there, and you can see plenty of bright white pockets of cloud within that general mass. This one right by Guatemala, that's a storm. That is Tropical Storm Selma. It's now over land. It's disintegrating fairly readily. The winds aren't too much of a problem in this storm, but the amount of rain is likely to give us more problems with flooding and potentially with some landslides as well. So also within this satellite picture and within all of this cloud, there's another circulation here that's edging its way northwards, and some of it is already over Cuba. This has a formation alert on it. This looks like it's developing into another storm. It hasn't quite been classed as a tropical storm yet. The winds aren't quite strong enough, but we're expecting this mass of cloud to work its way towards the northeast. And as it does so, some of us are likely to see some tropical storm force winds, most likely over parts of Cuba and the northern parts of the Bahamas. That's where we'll see the worst of the winds.
All right, still ahead on Al Jazeera. A change of policy. The U.S. is to bypass UN agencies and provide direct assistance to persecuted Christians in the Middle East.
I'm Zain Basravi in Veramin, Iran, where growers are trying to maximize the country's flower power.
And in sport, from the clubhouse to the courthouse, we'll tell you what punishment Tiger Woods is facing after a charge of driving under the influence. You're watching Al Jazeera. Let's recap the top stories this hour. Catalonia's deposed leader, Carles Puigdemont, has called for continued democratic opposition against direct rule from Madrid. His plea comes less than a day after the Spanish government dissolved Catalonia's regional parliament following a unilateral declaration of independence.
Per defensar les conquestes assolides fins avui.
The best way to defend what we have conquered so far is to have a democratic opposition to Article 155. This is the conclusion of the deliberate attempt against Catalans, who have for many centuries felt different. We have to overcome any threats and to act in a civic and peaceful manner.
Myanmar state media says the government will harvest rice from farmland abandoned by Rohingya families who fled violence in northern Rakhine state. The paddy fields cover over 70,000 acres in Mung Dao, the area worst affected in the crackdown by the Myanmar military against the Rohingya. A federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. has reportedly approved the first charges in the investigation into the alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. U.S. media says it's not yet known what the accusations are, but anyone charged could be taken into custody as early as Monday. The charges will be led by special counsel Robert Mueller. The U.S. Vice President says the country will no longer fund what he says are ineffective UN relief efforts for persecuted minorities in the Middle East. Mike Pence says funds will instead be distributed directly through the U.S. Agency for International Development. Ralston Jordan has more from Washington, D.C.
Christian groups in the United States have long wanted their government to do something about what they see as the ongoing persecution of Christians in the Middle East, especially in Iraq.
Our fellow Christians and all who are persecuted in the Middle East should not have to rely on multinational institutions when America can help them directly. And tonight, it is my privilege to announce that President Trump has ordered the State Department to stop funding ineffective relief efforts at the United Nations.
Pence's announcement was cheered by the evangelical community, which wields considerable political influence. But officials at both the State Department and the UN don't yet have a lot of details on the policy and funding changes.
This does not apply to all UN programs. It applies to programs that address the persecuted and displaced religious minority communities. USAID will be involved in this. The State Department will as well.
We continue to make sure that our aid efforts on the ground, including in Iraq, which was part of this discussion, are on the basis of need. And we try to serve all communities based on need.
This isn't the first time the Trump administration has pulled UN funding in order to advance its policy agenda. Earlier this year, it cut funding from the family planning program because of concerns over forced abortion in China, something which the government in Beijing denies. However, this plan to help a specific religious group is raising some concerns because it would use tax dollars to help a specific religious group, not help an entire country in crisis. U.S. law has long been clear. No public money can be used to pay for religious services, education, or proselytizing. And even though Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama allowed religious groups to apply for federal grants to help the needy around the world, these groups had to follow strict rules to make sure their programs served everyone, regardless of faith. One expert in the faith-based initiative community says the Trump administration could face lawsuits if it goes ahead with its plan.
The separation of church and state found in our Constitution and the Establishment Clause and case law would really impede something of that sort. I think Vice President Pence's announcement would kind of degrade that aspect and have a lot of smaller organizations vying for these funds that might not meet the requirements.
A fundamental conflict at work, trying to protect those being targeted because of their faith without breaching the U.S.'s wall between church and state. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera at the State Department.
Chile's government is struggling to control a growing number of new HIV cases. The country has one of the highest rates of new infections in Latin America. Now, the government has launched a campaign to target high-risk groups. Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, reports.
48-year-old Sandra, who asks that we not use her full name, was pregnant with her sixth child when she discovered her husband had infected her with HIV. She says her first thought was suicide. Now she's undergoing treatment and is back working at her husband's small broom factory. But while the treatment will deal with the HIV, she says it can't sweep away the stigma still associated with the disease.
There are still many people who think they'll get infected if they just touch me. Even my best friend. This is so terrible. I still can't accept it.
Sandra is one victim of an alarming health hazard. In the last 6 years, the HIV rate in Chile has more than doubled.
The main population infected with HIV are between the age of 20 and 50 years old, and mainly men, But we are seeing every day, new cases of people older than 50 years old, men and women who get infected. They don't usually use condoms.
Dr. Perez believes that because treatment for HIV is now readily available in Chile, many young people have lost what he calls respect for the disease, and so are no longer taking precautions. A new campaign is underway to underscore the need for safe sex at any age. The government already distributes 17 million condoms a year. But critics say the state needs to do much more. For example, sex education became mandatory in 2010, but only for secondary school students.
We need to implement an education campaign from childhood to adolescence in every single school. We need to reduce bureaucracy so people can get condoms more easily, or if they're infected, so they know where to go for testing and treatment.
Doctors here are calling the HIV rise an epidemic. It shocked many in socially conservative Chile, a country that experts say must quickly deal not just with the disease, but with the misconceptions and prejudices that help spread it. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago, Chile.
The number of refugees heading to Greece has surged in the past 2 months, putting a huge strain on facilities. Camps built to host 7,000 refugees are dealing with twice that number, and most of the refugees are arriving on the island of Lesbos, from where John Siropoulos reports.
These Afghans, Syrians and Africans are living in a tent city. There isn't enough room for them in Moria, the government-run camp on Lesvos, and they are vigilant about refugees who are in the camp crashing their lunch queue. Arrivals on the eastern islands in the Aegean Sea have increased from an average of 15 a day to almost 100 a day in the last 6 weeks. All are seeking asylum in Greece. In the terms of the agreement between Turkey and the European Union, Turkey promises to prevent as many people as possible from entering Greece illegally. Anyone who makes it is forced to stay here offshore if they wish to apply for asylum on the mainland. That, says the mayor of Lesvos, is turning the islands into an effective buffer zone for the EU.
Turning this island into a prison is the wrong policy. It punishes those who showed solidarity instead of rewarding them. It's criminal and unfair to divide Europeans into first and second class citizens, and we are definitely in the second class. We don't have the same rights as other Europeans or even other Greeks.
Authorities won't allow us to film inside Moria camp, currently hosting 5,000 people, more than twice its capacity and a record high since the EU-Turkey agreement came into force in March last year. That's because the agreement forbids the Greek government from moving new arrivals to the mainland. They sleep tent to a tent. Not everyone has a mattress or a blanket. There are no washing facilities, so the air is rank. Overcrowding and waiting are deepening the mental health problems of people who've already fled war, discrimination, imprisonment and rape.
The mentality of the people living in the camps is one of the prisoners. Yeah? And so you see a lot of the activities that one would see in any normal prison situation. Gangs, threats of violence, sexual assault, drug abuse.
And the problems go beyond mental health, says a nurse who works inside Moria.
We see a lot of upper respiratory tract infection and just the common cold that's given to everyone. So we call it the Moria virus. It just spreads super fast.
Across Europe, refugee numbers are down on last year, but not here. And in this corner of Greece, the people forced to look after the new arrivals are feeling the strain. John Psaropoulos, Al Jazeera, Lesvos.
Al Jazeera is demanding the release of its journalist Mahmoud Hussein, who's now been in Egyptian prison for more than 310 days. He's accused of broadcasting false news to spread chaos, claims he and Al Jazeera strongly deny. Hussein has repeatedly complained of mistreatment in jail. He was arrested in December while visiting his family. 3 Palestinian farmers have been injured by Israeli settlers as they tried to harvest their olives. It's the latest incident in a growing season beset by harassment near illegal settlements. Harry Fawcett spent the day with one group near the village of Salfit in the occupied West Bank.
In the pre-dawn light, a handful of farmers gather for the chance to get to their land. For a few minutes, Israeli soldiers open the gates. ID papers are taken, and they go from being locked out to locked in. They work fast. Beating the branches isn't good for the trees, but it's quick, which helps when you have a 6-week-old baby to tend to as well. Each family has just a few days not only to harvest their olives, but to carry out maintenance work that would normally be done throughout the year.
The trees don't get the trimming or fertilizing they need. The land doesn't get plowed or maintained, so the production goes down.
The restrictions are the result of the separation barrier and military road that cordon off the nearby illegal settlement of Ariel. The Palestinian Agriculture Ministry says of 11 million olive trees, 500,000 are cut off in this way, requiring coordination with the Israeli military to farm. A recent UN report said those trees were 65% less productive than those that are regularly tended. Less than 20 kilometers away near Nablus, another group of Palestinian farmers was confronted by Israeli settlers. 3 were injured. Earlier this month, by an illegal Israeli outpost in the same area, settlers simply helped themselves. Back in Salfit, we find Fouad and Lamiz harvesting some of the nearly 200 family trees. They say they get 2 days access to do 2 weeks' worth of work in February and 17 days now at harvest time.
We're at their mercy. It all happens quickly, as if we're stealing time. We come at dawn. Sometimes we wait until 8 or 8:30. We wait in the cold. Sometimes they come late, sometimes they come early. It's the same when we leave.
10 hours after they first opened, the gates are unlocked once again. The farmers expect another week or so of this restricted harvest season. From then until late winter, the locks will stay in place. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, Salfit in the occupied West Bank.
For years, barriers to international trade have held Iranian businesses from blossoming, but now Iranian florists are hoping seeds of success may lie in a global industry worth $104 billion a year. So, what's holding them back? Zain Basravi reports from Tehran.
The 14th century Persian poet Hafez once wrote, "The rose's beauty is very dear. Enjoy its petals when it is here." In Iran, they take that quite literally. From finely manicured streets to the vendors who sell roses by the basket, for happy and sad occasions, flowers are a part of daily life in Iran. Some streetlights even get their own flower beds. But Iranians say they haven't been able to realize the industry's potential.
One of the biggest challenges we face in Iran is a lack of modern technology. Most of the expertise exists in Europe, and we haven't been able to transfer that knowledge to Iran.
Mehdi Kebriai runs greenhouses in Veramin, a town a few hours outside Tehran. He says when sanctions were lifted after the nuclear deal, things got better. But to be competitive in the international marketplace, Iranian growers will need more help.
All the growers we've spoken to say the same thing. They wish that their government would focus a little bit more time on helping them modernize their industry, not just because of the economic potential, but because unlike the things you normally associate with Iran, oil and gas, nuclear energy, growers say there's nothing controversial about flowers. They're just beautiful and they make people happy.
It might be a hard sell. After all, the global oil and gas industry is worth nearly $1.7 trillion a year, and you can't run a car on flowers. But Kebriai says in Iran, flowers can be a serious business too, and that income from the agriculture sector could someday rival oil revenue.
Much as we care about seats in OPEC, I think we should pay even more attention to the seats in the Food and Agriculture Organization and pave the way for foreign investors in Iran.
But getting anything made in Iran to international markets is still a challenge.
The main problem now is the high cost of exporting. We cannot compete with the main flower exporting countries like Holland. We don't produce flowers in mass quantities. Since the production is low, it's mostly for domestic consumption.
But even half the flowers consumed domestically go to waste, dying in transit or left unsold once they get to market.
In a meeting with President Rouhani, I asked him to help our producers with low-interest long-term loans so they could modernize their greenhouses. Modernization is very expensive.
Those who are passionate about growing and selling flowers will tell you it's one of the best jobs in Iran, and that investing in new technology and infrastructure to reach untapped markets will be money well spent, as well as a chance for the country to show off its flower power. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Veramin, Iran.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, Joe will tell you what happened when the Warriors lived up to their name on the court. That's coming up in sport.